And this policeman turned around, said something to him, and then put his hand in his pocket and gave him a coin. So I ran up as a kid to get my share. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Policeman." And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "Fuck off, you little black bastard." Okay, my natural parents were, my mother was Jamaican, my father was from Nigeria. They came over in the late 50s and met in the UK. I was, between the two of them, I was their fourth child. I grew up in the early 60s when there was a thing called farming. And back in the village, back in Nigeria or places like that, the children would be taken care of by the elders and stuff like that, while the parents went out to get their education, set themselves up. So when they came here primarily for education. And so they needed someone to take the place of the grandparents, which is where the fostering arrangements took place. I was fostered when I was about 2 to 3 months old. I was given to a white foster family in a little village in Kent, where I grew up for the first 8 years of my life, in a village where I knew I was different, but I didn't understand why I was different, if that makes sense. Great upbringing. Foster parents were wonderful. Absolutely. Lots of hugs, lots of laughter. But there was always little things that reminded me. For example, at school, played cowboys and Indians. I was always the Indian. And I remember going to a teacher one day and said, "I want to be a cowboy." And the teacher just looked at me and said, "Oh, bless, you're the wrong color." Reading all the books we read in school, they were all white characters in the books. So, I was conscious as a kid, although not mentally conscious, there was something that knew that I wasn't part of the main thing. And I remember my foster mother used to say things like, "Why do you always give away your pocket money or your sweets?" And I think as a kid, I was trying to buy myself into a world that I didn't see myself reflected in. The only thing I knew about my father was every Friday an envelope would arrive. And in those days, it was called recorded delivery, and it had a little yellow strip on it. And that would be my father sending money to my foster mother to look after me. So all I knew is that she'd say, "Oh, it's a letter from your dad." But being a kid, it never really made any sense to me. It was just like something that was noise in the background, until the first time I can really remember seeing him was I was about 8 years old. And I came home from school, walked into the living room, and sitting on the sofa was this big black man. And this was the first time I had physically seen a black person in the flesh who wasn't on TV. And next to him was my suitcase. And I remember coming in as this 8-year-old kid thinking, "What's going on here?" And my foster mother said, "This is your father." And they said, "You're going to go to home for a couple of weeks." And I was like, "Home? I am home." And what I do remember is that he took me to the station. We got on the train from Canterbury to Victoria. And throughout the whole journey, he didn't say one word to me. And I still remember, I can still see myself. I just sat there looking at the rail tracks as we were going along and just watching it, almost hypnotized by these rail tracks. We arrived at Victoria Station, got off the train, and it was just noise. I'm a village kid at this time. I grew up in this little rural village, and suddenly I'm in the middle of this chaos. And I was so scared that I wet myself. And my dad's response to that was to start beating me. And I'm there thinking, I've just met this man, and now he's hitting me and shaking me, and I don't know who he is. It's like all rules are off. What's going on here? And to a kid, that's scary. And he starts dragging me off and mumbling to himself. Drags me to this house where this woman opens the door and says, "There's mommy's little boy." And she grabs me, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. And it was literally overnight, everything changed. I went from an all-white environment into an all-black environment. My dad and his relatives spoke this strange language. It was just a totally alien environment. My dad's response to my not fitting in was, I'm going to beat you until you do fit in. I remember thing like I came home from school one day because I was sent to school, and I've gone to this school where I'm used to being the only black kid, and suddenly I'm in this sea of blackness, and I'm thinking I don't know what's going on. I don't know how to fit in. Anyway, I came home from school one day and there was a packet of biscuits, shortbread biscuits on the table. And I came in, as I did millions of times in my foster parents' house, picked up a biscuit, put the TV on, sat down, eating the biscuit, watching the TV. My dad came in and just knocked 7 bells of whatever out of me, accused me of stealing the biscuit, and who told me I could put on the TV. I was a kid who was like, I didn't know where I fitted in. I didn't know what the rules are. But there was this thing that I was expected to know. And my dad was a very violent man. Very violent man. Between 8 and 16, because of all the beatings and stuff, I ran away from home quite a bit. And I would always run back to my foster parents' house. And they would have to come and pick me up and take me back. Social services became very much involved in my life once I started secondary school. Because once I started secondary school, for some reason, the beatings became more intense. And my dad had loads of punishments that he would make me do. And there was a punishment called picking pin, where you sort of bend over and you're balanced on one leg and one finger. And I was balanced in this position, and my cousins talking to my dad in Yoruba, which was the language. I didn't understand what's going on, but I knew that my dad was not listening. And I think I was 15, 16, and something inside me snapped, and I just stood up. And my dad shouted, we used to call it stoop down. He said, stoop down. And I just charged at him, pushed him over, ran down the stairs to the front door. It was locked. So I ran to the back door. It was locked. So I climbed out the bathroom window into the neighbor's garden, and their back door was open. And I still see it. I ran through their house, and they were sitting having dinner just to see this figure run. And I ran away again, came back, but I think that was the point where my dad realized he didn't have control over me. I came back home eventually, and my dad suddenly became this really nice guy. And my mother became really nice. The two of them became really, really nice. And I was allowed to go out, and suddenly I had this freedom. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, they're recognizing I'm growing up now. And then it got to about September, October of that year. This is 1979. And my father called me in and said, there's a big family reunion taking place in Nigeria. He said, I can't go because I've had this stroke, but I need you as my only son. I need you to go there and be a representative. Can you do that? And he said these magic words, can you be a man for me? And when you're a 16-year-old boy, that moment, yeah, I can be a man. Of course I can. Not only that, I wanted to go on a plane. I'd never been on a plane. So December 6, 1979, I'm at the airport with one of my uncles, and I'm taken to Nigeria. We arrived in Nigeria. I was told I was going for a 3-week holiday. I got there, and I think it was coming up to January, mid-January, and I said to my uncle, when am I going back? And I hadn't been to any family reunion or anything, so I'm like, what's going on? And my uncle looked at me and he laughed. And he said, you're not going back. He said, they didn't tell you. You're staying here. And I remember sitting there thinking, I've been tricked. Then a couple of days after I was told to pack my bags. My suitcase was thrown on this lorry filled with yams. Must have been for a good day and a half of driving through middle of nowhere. Arrived into this village where I was given to this man who was an old schoolmate of my father, and I was to be his servant. And his job was to discipline me. And I'm suddenly a kid from London in the middle of a village where there's no running water, no electricity, and just lost and confused. I managed to get some money together and I escaped from the village. And I remember arriving back in Lagos with my suitcase. And in my head, it was like, I'll get to Lagos and I'll find a way back to London. And I arrived in Lagos and suddenly realized I don't know where to go. I have no mental map. I have no idea how things work. I have nothing. There is no framework. And I remember standing in this bus stop and it was just chaos everywhere. And as it started to get dark, I saw some people under a bridge, sort of like sitting round and everything. And I thought, well, that's a group of people. If I go and sit with them tonight, tomorrow I can figure out something. Within a very short space of time, probably about a week or so, I'd sold all my stuff for food. So I had nothing. And that became my home. Under that bridge, I remember waking up next to dead bodies. You know, people who had died during the night. I watched people being killed. I remember one night sleeping, thinking somebody was getting fresh with me. And I felt something moving up my body. And I opened my eyes and there was this huge big rat just running up my body towards my face. It was also the place where I think I learned the most about the humanity of people. There were things like, you know, people would be arguing and fighting. Somebody would come in with a loaf of bread and we would be arguing and fighting about whatever it was. But that loaf of bread would still be shared amongst everybody. And it was like a great lesson in what it means to be a loyal friend, what it means to be true. We all had nothing. So the only thing we could share was ourselves. And to me, that's something that stayed with me all my life. I ended up, as I said, working in a steel plant as a welder. And somebody came to me one day and said, you're from London, right? And I'm like, yeah. And they said, well, we've got this lump of gold. There's some white people that work here. If you can sell them that lump of gold, you can keep half the money and buy yourself a ticket back to London. And I thought, okay. Took this lump of gold. There was an English guy who I knew worked there, a white English guy. Took it to him. He invited me to bring it to his house. He took it out the box and he scraped it. And it turned out to be a lump of lead sprayed gold. And he looked at my face and he said, you've been used. I said, yeah. And that was the beginning of a friendship. I think he was the only English guy amongst all the other Europeans that were working there. And I was from England. So every time I went round his house, it was like going back to a little piece of England. And then his wife came over for a holiday. And at the end of our holiday, we had this little party and we were drinking and people left. And then there's the last 3 or 4 of us just sitting around talking. And Richard was his name. Richard said, why don't you go back to England? And I'm like, how? I was earning the equivalent of about £25 a month. And I said, where am I going to get the money from? And he said, oh, okay. He said, where's your passport? And I said, I don't know. My uncle took it off me years ago. And he said, I'll tell you what, when my wife, Annette, gets back to the UK, we'll get you a new passport. We'll report that one lost and we'll get you a new passport. And I'm like, okay. So the new passport eventually arrives. And Richard says, I'm going to hold on to it because I don't want you to lose it. And then a few weeks later, I was around his house and we were sitting at the dining table and he was talking and he throws an envelope across the table. And he says, this is yours. Sorry, I've said this 1,000 times, but it still hits me. And I open up the envelope. And inside this envelope is my passport and a first-class ticket back to London. And he says, don't ask me why. And I remember sitting there looking at this passport. I'm a talker. But then I was just speechless. So 8 years after leaving the UK, I was on a plane with a little red sports bag. Inside this sports bag, I had 2 pairs of trousers, a shirt, a towel, and a suit I was wearing, which I'd borrowed from a friend. Well, borrowed. Flying back to the UK. somewhere I never ever thought I'd ever come back to.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
Growing up in the UK, before I went to Nigeria, I'd had 2 experiences of the police. I remember I was probably about 8 or 9, maybe 10. And I was walking to school with a little Irish lad called Eugene. And as we were walking down the road, there was a police officer walking up ahead of us. And Eugene went running up to him and said, "Hello, Mr. Policeman." And this policeman turned around, said something to him, and then put his hand in his pocket and gave him a coin. And I'm thinking, oh, the police are giving away money. So I ran up as a kid to get my share. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Policeman." And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "Fuck off, you little black bastard." And I remember being hit with those words. And it was like every conversation that had taken place in the living room now became real. I would say that's the moment I felt being black. I felt the pain of being black. That was my first experience. The second experience, I was about 13 or 14. And my dad was a Muslim. And we were going to the mosque in Regent Street for the Eid festival, end of month of Ramadan. And we were walking down the road and we get to this junction, there's just hundreds of people. And in the middle of the junction, there was a black police officer. And you're talking about, this is the 70s. I had never seen a black police officer. And he stood there in the middle of this junction and he went like that. And all the cars stopped. And I just felt this shiver go through me. And I remember standing there just looking at this guy in awe. When I look back on it, it was the first time I had seen a black person in a position of power. But it stayed in my head. So anyway, I come back. I had no intention of joining the police. And I'm working at this as a security guard. And the police used to come in to pick up the shoplifters that we had. And they used to hang around. And then they went from being the police to being Brian and Richard and Mary. And suddenly, and then we're going out drinking and becoming friends. And then they said, "You should consider joining." And eventually I put an application in. In fact, I put in 5 applications. So in 1992, I joined the Metropolitan Police, started at Hendon, thinking that, yes, this would be an environment where I could fit in. This was before Stephen Lawrence and before a lot of this stuff around equality and diversity was going on. So there were jokes that were made. You know, growing up in the village, I was aware of the jokes. I could handle a lot of the jokes, as I thought. But there was still constantly these little reminders again that you don't belong. And then I wanted to figure out, how can I prove to these people that I'm safe? And an opportunity came along where I was in my room one night and there's a knock at the door. And these guys came in and said, "You're the wrong color to be in this job." And we laughed a bit. And then they held me down, took out this shoe whitener, which was on the shelf, and they painted me white. And then there was my camera was on the side, and we took a picture. And when I tell that story, it sounds graphic, it sounds this, but it also for me, it's about what do we give up to fit in? If you speak to any of us on that day, none of us were thinking it, were aware of thinking that this is racist in any way, shape or form. We thought we were having a laugh. When I look back, it's that desperation to fit in. I was willing to give up my identity to fit in. Most of the colleagues I worked with, I mean, yes, there was the odd obnoxious idiot. And I say there were some people who were obnoxious, and sometimes in the police, that's what taints it. Because you hear about the bad ones. You don't hear about the guy who took me out to help me deliver my first death message to someone, to tell someone that their relative or their son or daughter had died. You don't hear about the guy who, when I got stabbed, knocked out the guy who stabbed me. You know, I said there's a difference between policing the profession and people within it who taint its name. Because there are a lot of good people out there, and it's a job where the expectations rightly are high. But matching those expectations is near on impossible. Because the resources aren't there, the management, leadership sometimes isn't there, and there's a culture within it that can sometimes exclude anything that's different. There are black people I went to arrest who felt threatened by me. Or if I was in a group of officers, I would immediately become the target. I remember my first Notting Hill Carnival. And when it come to the evening, we would stand in rows along the street to marshal people to the station. And we were standing in this row, about, must be 50, 100 of us all standing side to side. And I was the only black officer in this row of cops. And people would come around the corner. And it was interesting because as they came around, you could hear them coming. And it's almost as they came into this particular part where the silence came in. And as they walked past, black people would stop, look at me, and they'd spit at me. And I remember the sergeant standing behind me saying, "Hold it together, G, hold it together." But nobody came to me after and said, "Are you okay?" That was the interesting thing. Then there were moments, I remember, where I used to be on the beat, I used to see this black guy who was huge. You know, he had muscles on muscles. And every time I'd see him walking down the high road, in my head, I would think, I hope that guy's a good guy, because if ever he's a bad guy and he kicks off, I'm not going to be able to hold that guy down. And he would always have this look to me, which I interpreted as he hates me. And then there was this particular day, there was a fight in the high road that I was dealing with, and I'm sort of on my own, and I'm trying to manage, and I'm calling for backup and everything. And then I heard this voice behind me saying, "Don't worry, man, I got your back." And I turn around, and it's this huge black guy standing there protecting me. I remember one day as well, to take it on to another level, I went round, a young woman had been mugged on the way home from school, from work, from the train station. And I went round to report it, and I knocked on the door, and her mother opened the door. And she looked at me, and she said, "We don't allow in this house." And I stood there, and I said, "Well, I'm here as a police officer. And if you don't allow me in, nobody's coming to report this." And part of me was saying, can I say that? But I said it. The daughter said, "Mom, let him in." And I came in and I sat down, and I was taking the details and everything. And I could see the mom was sitting on the dining table behind me, and I could feel her eyes drilling in the back of my head. And by the time I finished, about 10, 15 minutes later, or whatever, I'm getting up to go. And she turned around and she said, "Officer, would you like a cup of tea or coffee before you go?" And I could have turned around and said, "No, to hell with you, you racist bitch." But I said, "Yeah, I'd love one. If you got some biscuits, that would be nice as well." Yeah, and you came out, I can't remember coming out of the house thinking, I've changed someone. I mean, I'd always known from when I was about 12 or 13 that I was attracted to same-sex. I never knew whether it was gay or something like that. In my head, there was always this thing about, I'm going to grow through this. I'll get past this. This is a phase I'm going through. All these thoughts were coming to my head. So I never allowed myself to have any relationships or anything like that. You know, you get into that point where people say, "Well, why haven't you got a girlfriend? Why aren't you married? Or why aren't you this?" And, you know, I made up this story about I had a girlfriend in America who had split up from me, and I called her the bitch. And I would tell a story. And I gave this character of this guy who had been jilted by love. So I created this whole story around this bitch, and it kept me safe for a while. But then you get to a point that even becomes a bit, and it didn't resonate with me. And everything was just, and then I got to a point where I almost committed suicide. And that wasn't just because of being gay. It was because I'd got to this point where sometimes there is just so much noise in the world telling you who you should be, how you should feel, what you should look like, what you should be proud of, what you should be angry of, what you should be ashamed of. And in all of that noise, you lose you. And I didn't even know who I was to be lost. So it wasn't even a losing. I didn't even know there was a me underneath all of that. And I got to that point where everything just collapsed. And I came out of that suicidal place and that place thinking, I need to find out who I am. It was a Monday morning and I went into work. Nope, this was not planned. There was no sort of like, this is what's going to happen. I went into work, I'm sitting at my desk typing, and there was a female sergeant who comes in, and she was talking about her boyfriend, and she had had an argument with her boyfriend over the weekend. And I'm sitting there and she goes, do you have this problem, G? With all the women you got on the go, how do you manage? And I remember sitting there, I was typing, and I looked up and I just said, I'm gay. And there was a look on her face. And then in my head, there's this thing like, what did you just do? It just literally, and I remember walking along the corridor and there was somebody coming up and I said, I'm gay. And they were like, okay. And there was a period where I had, it just saying it, you know, you go into a fast food restaurant, I'd have a hamburger, fries, and a milkshake, and I'm gay, by the way. I just had to tell people.
Because it's liberating.
It was liberating. Once you own it, no one can hurt you. Prior to that moment, if somebody had said anything about me being gay, I would be terrified. Now it's like, I don't care what you think. This is not your, the mistake you make is that you think I need your approval to be me. A couple of weeks after coming out, I was in the canteen speaking to a colleague of mine. She runs Pride. She was the police lady. And she goes, do you want to do a speech at Pride? And I'm like, hell yeah. So I found myself on the stage, Trafalgar Square, giving this speech about being a black gay officer and how proud I was. And it was suddenly everything changed. I remember I was invited to a conference to speak. One of my coming out songs, I have a coming out song, I would do, but one of my coming out songs was Labi Siffre's Something Inside So Strong. And then after I came out, I was invited to a conference, the first National Black Gay Men's Conference. And I was invited and I turned up at this place. It was in Notting Hill. Walked in and they had a poster of me hanging on the stage, which was like, oh, okay. And then I walked in and they took me to the speaker's table. And I remember sitting at this table, it's like, I got to go up there. And I sat down and I looked to my right and there was Labi Siffre. I'm like, holy whatever. Oh my God, you're Labi Siffre. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, yeah. And I'm sure there was a voice in his head saying, somebody call security. And I said, well, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm introducing the keynote speaker. And I thought, oh, the lucky so-and-so. And he gets up, reads a poem, and then introduces the keynote speaker. And everybody in this room was doing this standing ovation. I'm standing up thinking, where is this guy? And then there's that moment where you say, oh my God, it's me. And I remember walking up and standing on this stage, looking around this room. I've just been introduced by my hero. I'm now having a standing ovation. And I'm thinking, 20 odd so years before, I was sleeping under a bridge in Lagos. Now I'm in a room where I'm being celebrated. How the hell does that happen? I have found that vulnerability is my superpower. I have lost count and been humbled by. The amount of times people have come to me and said they felt liberated by me sharing my story. I think that when we share stories, that they help us connect. And I think as human beings, that's what makes us grow. And I think when you hear a good story, it does something to you. And if you're talking about a very personal story and a very deep story and stuff like that, when you connect with someone on that level, it enables them, it gives them permission to own their own story. And that's the magic for me. I made a film which came out a couple of years ago called The Black Cop. Now, this was a film that we made and it was just going to be a little film. And then suddenly I found myself standing in the Albert Hall accepting a BAFTA. Even from that, the amount of emails I've had about that film from people as far away as the outback of Australia, Romania, Venezuela. If people look at me and think, oh, it's all about him, you're missing the point. It's about you. It's about your story and how you tell your story and how you own your story. And I think what I do is I want to give people permission to own their own stories. Because I think we need that in the world today.